The first fence post went into the ground at exactly 7:14 in the morning, and by noon the most powerful woman in our HOA was begging people to find a way around it. The sharp crack of a post driver echoed across the lake as I stood on my dock with a coffee mug in one hand and a set of survey maps in the other. Across the water, a crowd had already started gathering near the HOA head office. Even from half a mile away, I could hear raised voices drifting across the calm surface of the lake. Some people looked confused. Others looked furious. One woman in particular looked like she had just watched her entire world tilt sideways. Her name was Sandra Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed queen of Lakeside Pines. And the reason I was standing there watching a perfectly legal fence change the course of her life. But that morning was not where this story started. The real beginning happened almost 4 months earlier during a community summer picnic. The smell of charcoal grills and lake water filled the air while families spread blankets across the grass near the marina. Children ran between picnic tables. Boats drifted lazily near the shoreline. It looked like the kind of small-town American scene people put on postcards. My name is Ryan Cooper. I am 42 years old, and I own a lake cabin that sits on the northern edge of the community. The cabin belonged to my grandfather before me. He built it with his own hands in the late 1960s. Every wooden beam, every stone in the fireplace, every board on the dock. Some of my earliest memories came from that property. Summer mornings fishing with my grandfather. Autumn evenings listening to rain hit the metal roof. Winter weekends watching snow settle across the frozen shoreline. To me, it was more than a cabin. It was family history. That afternoon, I was carrying a plate of barbecue back to my table when I heard Sandra speaking near the pavilion. Normally, I would not have paid attention. Sandra loved being the center of every conversation. But then I heard her mention my cabin. I slowed my pace. The sound of laughter carried through the crowd. Sandra stood with several residents and a tall young man wearing designer sunglasses. Her son, Tyler. I had met him twice before. He looked bored most of the time and acted as if every room belonged to him. Sandra smiled and pointed toward the far shoreline where my cabin sat beneath a row of pine trees. "That place will be perfect for Tyler," she said. Several people nodded politely. One woman asked if she meant someday. Sandra laughed. "Sooner than you think." I stopped walking. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. Then Tyler grinned and said, "The view alone is worth it." Sandra patted his shoulder. "You deserve it." The smell of grilled burgers suddenly seemed less pleasant. I stood there listening as if my brain refused to process what I was hearing. They were talking about my property. Not hypothetically, not casually. They spoke as though ownership was already decided. As though the cabin simply needed to be transferred into the correct hands. My hands tightened around the paper plate. Eventually, Sandra noticed me standing nearby. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Instead of looking embarrassed, she smiled. A confident smile. The kind of smile someone wears when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. Then she walked directly toward me. "Ryan," she said pleasantly, "I was just talking about your cabin." I heard. Her smile widened. "Beautiful property. Thank you. Have you ever considered selling?" The breeze coming off the lake carried the scent of pine and fresh water between us. I shook my head immediately. "No." Sandra looked almost amused by the answer. "Everyone has a price. Not this place." For the first time, her expression cooled slightly. "You might want to think about it." Then she glanced toward her son. "Tyler has always loved that shoreline." I remember standing there watching her walk away. I remember the strange feeling settling into my stomach. At the time, I assumed it was just another entitled conversation from another entitled HOA president. What I did not know was that Sandra Whitmore had already promised my cabin to her son. And when she realized I had no intention of selling, she decided she would find another way to get it. The next morning, the lake was perfectly still. A thin layer of mist hovered above the water while sunlight filtered through the pine trees surrounding my cabin. The smell of damp wood and fresh lake water drifted through the open window as I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. Normally, mornings at the cabin brought a sense of peace. That day felt different. Sandra's words kept replaying in my head. Not because she had asked to buy the property. People had asked before. What bothered me was the confidence behind her voice. She had not sounded hopeful. She had sounded certain. I tried pushing the thought aside and focused on work. As a contractor, I spent most of my days managing renovation projects around the county. By noon, I was reviewing plans at a job site nearly 20 miles away when my phone buzzed. The message came from the HOA office. At first, I assumed it was some routine community update. Instead, the subject line immediately caught my attention. Property compliance notice. I opened the email and stared at the screen. According to the notice, my dock required inspection due to possible violations of updated community standards. I frowned. The dock had existed for decades. It was inspected the previous year and passed without issue. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe someone had made a mistake. 2 days later, another notice arrived. This time, the issue involved exterior paint maintenance. A week after that came a landscaping violation regarding shoreline vegetation. Then another regarding a storage shed located behind the cabin. The shed had been there longer than most residents had been alive. By the end of the month, I had accumulated more compliance notices than I had received during the previous 10 years combined. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every morning seemed to bring another letter, another inspection, another complaint, another demand. The smell of printer ink became oddly familiar as I sorted through stacks of HOA correspondence covering my kitchen counter. One evening, I sat on the dock watching the sunset reflect across the lake when my neighbor Frank Mitchell pulled his fishing boat alongside. Frank had lived in the community for nearly 20 years. He tied off his boat and looked toward the growing pile of documents visible through my cabin window. "Sandra keeping you busy?" he asked. I laughed without humor. "Is it that obvious?" Frank nodded. "She has been talking about your property for months." That got my attention. I set down my coffee mug. Months. Frank adjusted his baseball cap and looked uncomfortable. Most people did not take her seriously. She kept saying your place would be perfect for Tyler. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine needles across the water. My stomach tightened. Did she ever explain why she thought she could get it? Frank shook his head. "No, but she acts like the decision is already made." After he left, I sat there long after dark thinking about everything that had happened since the picnic. The notices, the inspections, the sudden attention from the HOA. None of it felt random anymore. Over the following weeks, things escalated. HOA representatives appeared regularly. They photographed my property, measured structures, examined landscaping. At one point, a committee member informed me that my cabin might negatively impact future community development goals. I almost laughed when I heard that. The cabin existed long before most of the community, yet somehow I had become the problem. Then came the letter that finally convinced me Sandra had stopped pretending. It arrived on a Friday afternoon. The envelope contained a formal offer to purchase the cabin. The amount was lower than comparable lakefront properties. Much lower. Attached to the offer was a handwritten note. Not signed. Not official. Just a short message written across a yellow sticky note. "Think carefully. This is probably your best opportunity." I stared at those words for several seconds. Outside, waves gently tapped against the dock. Somewhere across the lake, a boat engine hummed in the distance. The entire situation suddenly became crystal clear. Sandra was not trying to negotiate. She was trying to wear me down. She believed enough pressure would eventually force me to give up. What she did not realize was that every notice, every inspection, every letter was pushing me toward a different decision entirely. If she wanted to fight over property rights, I was finally ready to start paying attention. The following Monday, I decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting. The smell of fresh rain lingered in the air as I parked outside the community center just before sunset. A row of luxury vehicles already filled most of the parking lot. Through the large front windows, I could see residents gathering inside with coffee cups and folders tucked under their arms. Normally, I avoided HOA meetings whenever possible. Most of them involved discussions about landscaping guidelines, parking rules, or budget reports. But after weeks of notices and inspections, I wanted to hear what Sandra had to say when she thought she controlled the room. The community center smelled faintly of polished wood and brewed coffee. Soft conversations echoed across the hall as residents found their seats. I took a chair near the back. Several people nodded politely when they recognized me. Others looked away. A few seemed almost uncomfortable. That alone told me how much discussion had been happening behind the scenes. At exactly 7 o'clock, Sandra stepped to the front of the room. She wore the same confident smile I had seen at the summer picnic. Her cream-colored blazer looked perfectly pressed. Her posture radiated authority. To anyone unfamiliar with the situation, she appeared to be the model HOA president. The meeting began normally enough. Budget updates, maintenance projects, marina improvements. Then Sandra shifted the discussion toward community development opportunities. The large screen behind her displayed images of shoreline properties around the lake. My attention sharpened immediately. She clicked through several photographs before stopping on an aerial image that included my section of shoreline. My cabin was clearly visible near the water. A strange silence settled over me. Sandra pointed toward the screen. Some areas of the community remain underutilized despite their exceptional potential, she said. The phrase sounded familiar. Underutilized. I remembered hearing almost the exact same language in one of the letters I received weeks earlier. Several residents exchanged glances. Sandra continued. Strategic redevelopment could create tremendous value for everyone. The words were carefully chosen. Professional. Neutral. But I knew exactly what she meant. She was talking about my property without saying my name. One resident raised his hand and asked whether any specific projects were under consideration. Sandra smiled. Nothing official at this time. Then her eyes briefly found mine across the room. Some opportunities simply require cooperation. The message could not have been clearer. After the meeting ended, people slowly filtered toward the exits. The sound of folding chairs echoed through the hall. I was halfway to the parking lot when someone called my name. I turned and found a woman named Linda Harper hurrying toward me. Linda had lived near the marina for years and rarely involved herself in community politics. Her expression looked nervous. "Ryan, can I ask you something?" she said quietly. We stepped aside near a row of decorative shrubs outside the building. Crickets chirped in the darkness while a cool breeze moved through the trees. Linda hesitated before speaking. "Did Sandra ask you to sell your cabin?" The question caught me off guard. "Why?" She glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. "Because she has been talking about it for months." My stomach tightened. "Talking about what exactly?" Linda lowered her voice. "She keeps telling people that eventually the property will belong to Tyler. Some residents thought you had already agreed." For a moment, I simply stared at her. The realization felt heavier than any compliance notice I had received. Sandra was not just pressuring me privately. She was creating expectations publicly. She wanted the community to believe the transfer was inevitable. Linda continued. "I did not think much of it at first. Then the inspection started. Then the complaints. It all seemed connected. The parking lot lights reflected off wet pavement as silence settled between us. Everything suddenly made more sense. The notices were not random. The board discussions were not random. The conversations spreading through the neighborhood were not random. Sandra was building a narrative. She wanted people to believe I was the obstacle standing in the way of progress. And if enough people accepted that story, she probably assumed I would eventually give up. As I drove back toward the cabin that night, headlights sweeping across the winding lakeside road, I realized something important. Sandra was investing an enormous amount of time and energy trying to acquire one piece of property. People do not work that hard without a reason. Which meant somewhere beneath all the pressure, there was something about my cabin she wanted far more than she was willing to admit. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped reacting and started observing. The smell of lake water and pine sap followed me everywhere as summer slowly settled over the shoreline. Every morning brought another reason to pay closer attention. Sandra's campaign had become too organized to ignore. The notices continued arriving with almost mechanical precision. If I repaired one issue, another appeared. If I answered one complaint, a different concern surfaced a few days later. What fascinated me was how carefully everything stayed within the appearance of legitimacy. Nothing was outrageous enough to trigger immediate outrage. Nothing was dramatic enough to attract outside attention. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. One afternoon, I sat on my dock reviewing invoices when I noticed a black SUV parked near the entrance road leading toward my cabin. The vehicle remained there for nearly an hour. Eventually, it drove away. 2 days later, I saw it again. This time, I recognized the driver. Tyler. He was parked beside the shoreline, staring toward my property through a pair of sunglasses while talking on his phone. The sight struck me as oddly revealing. Most people interested in buying a property visit it once or twice. Tyler seemed to be studying it. The following weekend brought another community event near the marina. I attended mostly out of curiosity. The smell of kettle corn drifted through the crowd while live music echoed across the lake. Families wandered between vendor booths. Boats lined the docks. Everything looked cheerful on the surface. Yet beneath the normal atmosphere, I could feel conversations changing whenever I approached. People lowered their voices. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed unsure what to believe. The narrative Sandra had been building was spreading. I confirmed that later in the afternoon when a resident I barely knew approached me near a food stand. "I heard you might be selling," he said casually. I almost laughed. "You heard wrong." The man looked surprised. "Really? I thought it was already being negotiated." There it was again. Not a rumor. An expectation. By the time I returned home that evening, I was more convinced than ever that Sandra wanted something larger than the cabin itself. The question was why. A few days later, I received an unexpected answer. The county planning office called regarding a routine permit on one of my construction projects. While discussing paperwork, the clerk mentioned something interesting. "By the way," she said, "your community submitted another development inquiry." My attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of inquiry?" There was a brief pause as she reviewed records. "Expansion possibilities around the northern shoreline." I stared through my office window at the distant lake. The northern shoreline. My shoreline. After ending the call, I drove straight to the county records office. The building smelled like old paper and floor polish. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as I requested public planning documents related to recent HOA proposals. An hour later, I sat at a large wooden table surrounded by maps and applications. The first few documents seemed harmless. Walking trails, recreational improvements, marina upgrades. Then I found a conceptual development sketch. My pulse immediately quickened. The drawing showed a proposed lakeside recreation complex extending directly through the area occupied by my cabin. Restaurants, event spaces, boat access facilities, premium shoreline amenities. It was not an approved project, not even close, but it revealed something important. Sandra's obsession was never really about Tyler wanting a nice cabin. Tyler was simply the excuse. The property itself was the prize. My cabin occupied one of the most strategically valuable sections of shoreline in the entire community. Any future expansion plan would become dramatically easier if that land changed hands. Suddenly, every inspection notice made sense. Every complaint, every offer, every conversation. Sandra was not acting emotionally. She was acting strategically. As I left the records office carrying copies of the documents, a warm breeze moved through the parking lot. For the first time since this began, I felt calm. Truly calm. Because once you understand someone's real objective, their behavior becomes predictable. Sandra thought she was playing a long game. What she did not realize was that she had just shown me the board. And the moment I saw the board, I started looking for her weakest move. The next several days became an exercise in patience. The smell of sawdust and fresh-cut lumber filled my truck as I moved between construction sites, but my mind kept returning to the documents I had copied from the county office. Every time I looked at the development sketches, I became more convinced that Sandra's plan extended far beyond one cabin. She saw the northern shoreline as the missing piece in a much larger project. The problem for her was that she had spent so much energy trying to pressure me that she never considered I might start investigating the details myself. One cool Thursday morning, I drove to the cabin before sunrise. A layer of fog hovered over the lake, while loons called from somewhere beyond the marina. The water reflected the pale orange glow of the coming day. I sat on the dock with a notebook and spread out copies of property maps across the wooden boards. At first, I was only comparing shoreline boundaries. Then I noticed something strange. One of the development sketches included a service access route leading toward the proposed recreation complex. Curious, I traced the route across multiple parcels. The line continued past the marina, around a maintenance yard, and eventually reached the HOA administrative building near the center of the community. That alone was not unusual. What caught my attention was where the route originated. I studied the maps again. Then a third time. The more I looked, the less sense it made. Around noon, I called an old friend named Mark Jensen. Mark was a professional surveyor who had worked on several commercial projects with me over the years. He agreed to meet that afternoon. The smell of hot asphalt rose from the parking lot as we sat at a picnic table outside a small diner reviewing the documents. Mark spent nearly 20 minutes silently examining the maps. Finally, he leaned back and frowned. "That is interesting." My pulse quickened. "What?" He tapped a finger against one corner of the survey. "The access route. What about it?" Mark looked up. "You should probably pull the original easement records." The comment seemed oddly specific. "Why?" He folded the maps and slid them back across the table. Because if these drawings are accurate, the entire administrative property may depend on a very narrow access corridor. The word stayed with me all evening. After dinner, I drove straight to the county archives. The building closed in less than an hour, so I moved quickly. The archive room smelled like aging paper and dust. Metal shelves stretched in every direction. I located the easement records and began searching parcel histories connected to the HOA property. The process was tedious. Page after page, filing after filing. Most revealed nothing useful. Then I found a survey from nearly 20 years earlier. My eyes narrowed immediately. The access corridor Mark mentioned appeared clearly on the map. More importantly, the corridor crossed land that now belonged to me. I pulled additional records. Then more. Piece by piece, the history emerged. The HOA headquarters sat on a parcel that technically connected to the community only through a narrow strip of land near the lakeshore. Decades earlier, temporary access arrangements allowed construction traffic to pass through. Temporary. The word practically glowed on the page. I kept reading. There was no permanent easement recorded afterward. No long-term access grant. No updated agreement. Nothing. The silence inside the archive room suddenly felt louder than before. Outside, darkness settled over the town. Inside, I stared at the documents spread across the table. My heart was beating faster now. The administrative building that Sandra used to control the entire community appeared to depend on a legal assumption nobody had questioned for years. I carefully gathered copies and returned to the cabin. The night air smelled of pine and cool lake water. Waves tapped softly against the shoreline as I sat beneath a porch light reviewing the records again. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion. Sandra had spent months trying to force me off my property while apparently never realizing that the most important building under her control depended on rights she could not actually prove. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I smiled. Not because I had won anything yet. Not because I had a complete plan. But because I finally understood why Sandra's pressure campaign felt so desperate. She believed she held all the leverage. What she did not know was that buried beneath decades of paperwork sat a weakness so significant that it could change the entire balance of power in the community. For the next week, I told absolutely nobody what I had found. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across the lake each morning while residents went about their routines completely unaware that a single strip of land had suddenly become the most important property in the entire community. I continued working my normal schedule, answering emails, managing construction projects, and responding politely whenever another HOA notice appeared in my mailbox. On the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything had changed. Every evening after work, I returned to the cabin and spread documents across the dining table. The old wood surface disappeared beneath surveys, title records, easement filings, and historical maps. The gentle sound of water lapping against the shoreline mixed with the rustle of paper as I compared records from different decades. The more I researched, the stronger the pattern became. The administrative building depended on an access corridor crossing a narrow section of land connected to my property. Even more surprising, the original temporary access arrangement had expired years earlier without ever being replaced by a permanent recorded easement. Somehow everyone simply assumed the issue had already been resolved. That assumption had survived for nearly 2 decades. One afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney named Michael Benson. His office overlooked the town square and smelled faintly of leather-bound books and coffee. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as I placed copies of the documents on his desk. Michael spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. He asked questions, checked dates, compared surveys. Then he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "This is unusual," he said. "Good unusual or bad unusual?" I asked. A small smile appeared on his face. "For you? Potentially very good." He explained that access rights are often treated casually until somebody finally examines the paperwork. Communities grow. Buildings are constructed. Roads expand. People assume everything was handled correctly somewhere along the way. Occasionally, they are wrong. Michael tapped a finger against one of the survey maps. The important thing is not what people believe exists. The important thing is what was actually recorded. Those words stayed with me during the drive home. The late afternoon sun reflected off the lake as I followed the shoreline road toward the cabin. Sandra had spent months trying to shape perception. She wanted people to believe my property was standing in the way of progress. She wanted residents to see her as the reasonable leader searching for solutions. But property law does not care about popularity. It cares about records. 2 days later, I received another letter from the HOA. This one demanded corrective action regarding a decorative retaining wall near my dock. I stared at the notice and laughed for the first time in months. The wall had existed for years without complaint. The timing was almost impressive. Sandra was still pushing forward, completely unaware of the problem growing beneath her feet. That evening, I walked the property, carrying copies of the surveys. The smell of pine needles filled the cool air while the last light of day settled across the water. Eventually, I reached the narrow section of land highlighted in the records. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A modest stretch of ground covered with grass and small trees. Nothing about it appeared valuable. Yet every road leading toward the administrative building ultimately depended on this location. I stood there for several minutes, imagining the chain reaction that would occur if the issue were ever formally addressed. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. The message came from Frank Mitchell. He wanted to know whether I planned to attend the upcoming community planning meeting. Apparently, Sandra intended to present new concepts for future shoreline development. I looked out across the lake as twilight deepened around the cabin. Suddenly, everything became clear. Sandra still believed she was controlling the timeline. She thought pressure would eventually force me into a corner. What she did not realize was that I had already stopped playing defense. The question was no longer whether I could protect my cabin. The question was how long I wanted to wait before showing everyone exactly where the real leverage had been hiding all along. The community planning meeting took place on a warm Thursday evening as the last light of sunset reflected across the lake. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the open windows of the community center while residents filled nearly every seat inside. Conversations bounced off the walls as people discussed marina improvements, future projects, and the latest rumors circulating around the neighborhood. I arrived early and took a seat near the back of the room. A thick folder rested on my lap. Inside were copies of surveys, easement records, title documents, and enough paperwork to answer every question Sandra never wanted asked. Across the room, Sandra moved confidently between residents, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. She looked completely comfortable. If she felt any concern about the pressure campaign she had launched against me, she hid it well. Tyler sat nearby scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing toward me with the same smug confidence I had seen for months. The meeting began at 7 o'clock sharp. The smell of coffee lingered in the air as board members reviewed routine business. Budget reports, maintenance schedules, landscaping contracts. Nothing unusual. Then Sandra stepped to the front of the room and launched into a presentation about the future of the community. Large renderings appeared on the screen behind her. New walking trails, expanded recreational facilities, upgraded shoreline amenities. Residents nodded approvingly. The projects looked impressive. Then Sandra displayed a familiar image. My section of shoreline appeared on the screen, the same area shown in the development sketches I had discovered weeks earlier. Her voice remained calm and professional. Certain properties continue to limit opportunities that could benefit the entire community, she explained. Several people turned toward me. I could feel their eyes. Sandra never mentioned my name, but she did not need to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes. By the end, the message was clear. She wanted residents to believe that one stubborn property owner was standing between them and a brighter future. When the floor opened for comments, I raised my hand. The room grew noticeably quieter. Sandra hesitated for a fraction of a second before calling on me. I stood slowly. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoed through the room. "I have a question," I said. Sandra smiled politely. "Of course." I opened my folder and removed several maps. Before discussing future expansion, has the board reviewed the access documentation connected to the administrative property? The smile on her face barely changed, but I noticed something flicker behind her eyes. Confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied. "I mean the access corridors serving the HOA headquarters." Several residents exchanged puzzled looks. Sandra folded her arms. "The building has existed for years." "I know," I said. "That was not my question." The room became very still. Even the air seemed to change. I continued calmly. "Can the board confirm that permanent access rights were properly recorded?" Sandra glanced toward one of the board members. Then another. Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched longer than expected. I already knew why. They had never checked. Eventually, Sandra cleared her throat. I do not see how that relates to tonight's agenda. A few residents shifted in their seats. Curiosity spread through the room. It relates because the same property records being used to pressure private owners should probably apply to everyone equally. More silence. Then a resident near the front raised his hand. What exactly are you saying? I looked around the room. Every face seemed focused on me now. I am saying there may be unresolved access issues affecting the headquarters property. The reaction was immediate. Not outrage. Confusion. Questions started appearing from every direction. Board members whispered among themselves. Sandra attempted to redirect the conversation, but the room had already changed. For months, she controlled the narrative. For months, every discussion focused on my property. Now people were asking questions about hers. I did not reveal everything that night. That was never the goal. I simply planted the first seed. As residents left the building later that evening, small groups gathered in the parking lot discussing surveys, easements, and property records. The smell of lake water drifted through the darkness as I walked toward my truck. Behind me, Sandra remained near the entrance, speaking urgently with several board members. For the first time since this started, she looked uncertain. And uncertainty was exactly what I wanted. Because while everyone else drove home wondering whether there might be a problem, I already knew the answer. The survey crew would arrive the following week. The permits were already approved. The materials had already been ordered. And the fence posts waiting inside a local supplier's warehouse were about to become the most famous pieces of lumber in the entire community. The survey crew arrived at sunrise on a Tuesday. A cool breeze moved across the lake, carrying the smell of wet grass and fresh water as two white trucks rolled slowly down the shoreline road. Their amber warning lights flashed against the morning fog while residents walking dogs paused to watch. I stood near the property line holding a travel mug filled with coffee. Months earlier, this would have looked like an ordinary surveying job. Now it felt like the opening move in a much larger game. The crew unloaded equipment with practiced efficiency. Tripods, GPS receivers, boundary markers, survey flags. The metallic clicks of instruments echoed softly across the quiet shoreline. By 8 o'clock, bright orange flags stretched across portions of the land, connecting the access corridor to the administrative property. People started noticing immediately. Several residents stopped to ask questions. I answered politely, just verifying boundaries. Technically, that was true. Across the lake, the morning sun burned away the fog while rumors began spreading through the community faster than I expected. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Sandra. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, she called again. Then again. Eventually, a text message appeared. We need to talk immediately. I smiled and slipped the phone back into my pocket. For months, she controlled every conversation. Today, she could wait. By lunchtime, the survey crew completed their measurements. The lead surveyor handed me preliminary confirmations matching everything I already suspected. The access corridor crossed property under my control. More importantly, no recorded permanent easement appeared in the chain of title. The sound of a speedboat echoed somewhere across the lake as I folded the paperwork and placed it inside my truck. The next phase could finally begin. Over the following 3 days, materials arrived in stages. Fence posts, hardware, gates, lumber. Everything was delivered legally and stored on my property. Residents watched with growing curiosity. Sandra watched with growing concern. By Friday afternoon, the entire community seemed to know something unusual was happening. Nobody knew exactly what, but everyone sensed change approaching. The confrontation finally happened that evening. The sun hung low above the water, painting the shoreline gold, when Sandra's SUV pulled into my driveway. Gravel crunched beneath her tires as she stepped out and marched toward the cabin. Her expression looked nothing like the confident smile she usually wore. Ryan, she called. We need to discuss this. I remained seated on the porch. The smell of pine drifted through the evening air. Discuss what? I asked calmly. She pointed toward the stacked fencing materials. That. I took a sip of coffee. Those are fence supplies. Her jaw tightened. Do not play games. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The lake water lapped gently against the dock below. Finally, she crossed her arms. What exactly are you planning? The question told me everything. She already suspected the answer. Improving my property, I said. Her eyes narrowed. You know very well what this is about. I looked directly at her. Actually, Sandra, I think for the first time we both know what this is about. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. She glanced toward the lake before lowering her voice. You are making a mistake. That line almost made me laugh. After months of inspections, threats, complaints, and pressure campaigns, she wanted to talk about mistakes. Interesting, I replied. I was beginning to think the same thing. She left shortly afterward without another word. The next morning construction began. The first fence post entered the ground at exactly 7:14. The rhythmic pounding echoed across the community like a drumbeat. One post became 5. 5 became 20. By mid-morning, residents gathered along nearby roads watching the project unfold. Phones appeared. Pictures circulated. Questions multiplied. Then came the moment everything changed. Shortly before noon, the final section connected across the access corridor. The crew secured the gate and stepped back. Legally, properly, fully permitted, completely within the boundaries established by the survey. A strange quiet settled over the area. The administrative building still stood exactly where it had always stood. Nothing about the structure changed. Yet suddenly everyone understood the same thing. Access depended on rights that had never been properly secured. I stood near the shoreline watching the realization spread through the crowd. Across the road, Sandra emerged from the administrative building and froze. Her eyes moved from the survey markers to the fence line and finally to the locked gate. The expression on her face was not anger. Not at first. It was disbelief. Pure disbelief. Because after spending months trying to force me off my property, she had just discovered that the most important piece of land in the entire community was the one she never bothered to check. The week after the fence went up felt unlike anything I had ever experienced. The smell of fresh lumber still lingered in the air each morning as residents gathered near the access corridor to see the structure everyone was talking about. What fascinated me most was how quickly the conversation changed. For months people discussed my cabin, my property, my supposed refusal to cooperate. Now every conversation centered on easements, access rights, surveys, and a question nobody could stop asking. How had the HOA allowed this to happen? The answer was simple. They never thought they needed to check. Sandra spent years assuming authority was the same thing as ownership. Unfortunately for her, county records do not care about assumptions. 3 days after construction finished, the HOA attorney contacted my attorney. Then another meeting was requested. Then another. The tone of those conversations differed dramatically from the letters I had received months earlier. Gone were the demands. Gone were the warnings. Gone were the threats of compliance action. Suddenly, everyone wanted to discuss solutions. The smell of coffee filled a conference room overlooking the lake as representatives from the HOA sat across from me reviewing documents they should have reviewed years ago. Sandra was there as well. She looked tired. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just tired. For the first time since this entire conflict began, she seemed to understand the position she was actually in. The surveys confirmed everything. The title history confirmed everything. The access issue was real. More importantly, the fence itself violated nothing. Every permit had been approved. Every boundary had been verified. Every measurement had been documented. The same system Sandra tried to use against me had ended up protecting me. Negotiations continued for several weeks. Residents demanded transparency. Board members wanted answers. Questions surfaced regarding past decisions, development plans, and why so many resources had been devoted to acquiring my property. The more people learned, the less comfortable they became. Eventually, the truth spread throughout the community. The proposed shoreline expansion, the pressure campaign, the repeated attempts to force a sale. What surprised me most was how many residents supported me once they understood the full story. They were not angry because the HOA made a mistake. They were angry because they had been misled. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake, I attended what would become Sandra's final board meeting as president. The community center felt unusually quiet. The smell of rain drifted through open windows while residents filled every seat. Sandra stood at the front of the room and delivered a short statement. She acknowledged mistakes. She accepted responsibility for decisions that contributed to the situation. Then she announced her resignation. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The room simply sat in silence. Sometimes consequences do not arrive with shouting. Sometimes they arrive with a resignation letter and a room full of disappointed people. Over the following months, the HOA reached a formal agreement addressing the access issue. New arrangements were negotiated properly. Records were updated correctly. Most importantly, the campaign against my cabin ended permanently. No more notices. No more inspections. No more mysterious complaints. The pressure vanished almost overnight. One cool autumn morning, I stood on the dock watching golden leaves drift across the water. The lake looked exactly the way it had when my grandfather first brought me there as a child. The scent of pine trees mixed with fresh lake air while sunlight sparkled across the surface. Peace had finally returned. Later that afternoon, I drove past the administrative building. The fence still stood exactly where it had been built. Residents often joke that it should be preserved as a historical landmark. In a strange way, they were right. It had become a reminder, not of revenge, not of victory, a reminder that property rights matter, records matter, boundaries matter. Most of all, it reminded people that power only works when it stays within the rules. As for Tyler, he never got the cabin his mother promised him. The cabin remained exactly where it belonged, surrounded by pine trees and family memories. Every board, every stone, every section of shoreline remained part of the life my grandfather built decades earlier. Sometimes I still sit on the porch in the evening listening to waves tap against the dock. And every now and then I think back to that summer picnic when Sandra confidently told people my property would belong to her son. She was right about one thing. The future eventually arrived. It just did not arrive the way she expected. Because in the end, the woman who tried to take my cabin found herself asking permission to solve a problem she created, and the fence she never saw coming became the clearest lesson the community had ever learned. Justice does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a survey map, a property line, and a perfectly legal fence standing quietly beside a lake.